Great. So we're going to go ahead and get started. I want to welcome everyone tonight. I also want to acknowledge that we are based in and doing work from communities in the unceded territory of the Wabanaki Confederacy. Thanks everyone for joining us this evening for the first in a series of online opportunities from the Community Resilience Partnership regional coordinators and our partners. This series is entitled Building Stronger Communities. It's designed for communities who are enrolled in the Community Resilience Partnership, those who are currently enrolling in the partnership, and also those who are interested in enrolling. So I'll share more about the Community Resilience Partnership in just a minute. But first, let me introduce myself and also my fellow presenters. So my name is Gabe McPhail. I serve as one of the regional coordinators in Region 1 of the Community Resilience Partnership. I work with colleagues in Southern Maine, the Southern Maine Planning and Development Commission, Greater Portland Council of Governments, and also in Lincoln County with Lincoln County Regional Planning Commission. And I know some of my colleagues are on tonight, so I want to give a shout out to them. So we in Region 1 support communities in the Community Resilience Partnership, those enrolled and those seeking to enroll, located in York, Cumberland, Saginaw, Lincoln, and Knox counties. So I'm joined tonight by my colleague, Tanya Rakowski. Tanya is the regional coordinator for Region 2, which covers Waldo, Hancock, Washington counties. And I want to say a special thank you to our partners who are joining us to present tonight from the Gulf of Maine Research Institute, or GMRI. So Gail Bonus. Gail serves as the Municipal Climate Action Program Manager at GMRI. And Hannah Baroness, who is GMRI's Coastal Hazards Researcher. So I also, beyond thanking them, just want to give a special shout out to everyone who's attending tonight via a community-based watch party. Thanks for joining us. Glad folks could gather, and hope you find this conversation fruitful and hope that it sparks some conversation after. So again, a reminder that this event is being recorded for later viewing. So hopefully not to be too boring or redundant, I am going to just go over quickly the Zoom etiquette just as protocol for this meeting. Stay on mute unless you're speaking. If you have anything distracting going on, it's best to keep your video off, but otherwise it's fine to have your video on. We like to see faces. If your name does not appear as you would like us to respond to you or address you, please rename yourself in whatever way you would like us to identify you. And there's some instructions on the screen as to how to do that. I don't think anyone is joining us by phone tonight, so I will not share any information about phone participation unless I see someone come on via phone. Importantly, you may have questions that come up throughout the talk tonight. And so I really encourage you to put those questions in the chat. We are gonna start with chat questions first when we get to the Q&A, and then we'll move to verbal questions. So throughout the presentation, we'll be collecting those questions and we'll be making sure to address them during the Q&A portion of the evening. So a quick overview of what we will be covering tonight. First, I'm going to give a quick introduction and sort of lay of the land and provide some context to these talks and the climate resilience work that is being done by communities, not just through the Community Resilience Partnership, but across Maine. And then I'm going to turn things over to our colleagues at GMRI. And we're going to look at sea level rise. So we're going to do a little sea level rise 101. We're going to talk about some adaptation strategies. And then Tanya and I are going to share a bit about some examples / case studies of communities that are enrolled in the Community Resilience Partnership who have received grants from the Community Resilience Partnership and are using those funds to adapt to sea level rise in one way or another. And you'll see there's a wide variety of ways that communities are addressing sea level rise, and it's usually not just in isolation. They're doing a whole bunch of other things while they're taking climate adaptation into the work that they're doing. So let's go back to where I said I would tell you a little bit more about the Community Resilience Partnership. So the Community Resilience Partnership, and for those of you who don't know, the partnership is a program of the Governor's Office of Policy, Innovation, and the Future. It's a program that's aligned with Maine Won't Wait's, the Maine Won't Wait 4-year climate action plan for the state of Maine. So it's intended to help Maine communities reduce emissions and prepare for the impacts of climate change. The partnership provides both grant funding and technical assistance, direct support to municipalities and tribal governments for climate mitigation and climate adaptation projects. So how does the partnership work? So to be able to access the benefits of the partnership, you need to be an enrolled community. So communities can enroll either on their own, or sometimes there isn't enough help. So you want to ask a service provider to assist you. And so service providers are able to get funding through the partnership to assist up to 5 communities, a minimum of 2 communities, and help them enroll in the partnership. And enrollment involves completing some assessments, conducting a community workshop to identify your climate priorities, submitting those materials, and also passing a municipal resolution that commits that community to the priorities that you've identified. And once you are in the partnership, once you've enrolled, you have access to community action grants that are available twice a year in the spring and the fall. And you also have access to your regional coordinators. So Tanya and I also have a couple other counterparts in the state of Maine, Region 3 and Region 4, which serve Western and Northern Maine. And so the regional coordinators, our job is really to provide technical assistance, get you access to training, offer coordination of projects, help with grants, particularly larger state and federal funding opportunities. And those are what's really required to implement some of these large scale projects. And we'll have a couple examples of those tonight. So I promised too that I was going to say a little bit about context and framework. And I just want to do this because there's often a lot of words floating out around climate resilience. Resilience is a very popular word, and it can mean a lot of different things depending on who we're talking to. So for the sake of the work that we do in the Community Resilience Partnership, I like to define climate resilience as the ability of a community to anticipate, plan for, and mitigate or lessen the dangers, and also to seize the opportunities associated with environmental and social change. And we could probably put economic change in there as well. So any sort of change to the systems that we are really dependent on. So traditional definitions of resilience talk a lot about a system's ability to bounce back from a disaster or from a hazard in the face of adversity. So really, we are trying to do better than the status quo. We really want to make communities stronger. And that's why I usually prefer to say bounce forward instead of bouncing back. So that's really what community resilience is to us. And so throughout this series, Building Stronger Communities, we're going to be discussing how communities enrolled in the Community Resilience Partnership are using the partnership funds that are available to them to build stronger communities. This might be through actions that relate to adaptation or to mitigation. And adaptation and mitigation are part of climate resilience. So climate mitigation refers to any strategy or action to remove greenhouse gas emissions in the atmosphere or reduce the amount of greenhouse gas emissions in the atmosphere. And climate adaptation refers to the ability of a system to prepare for and make adjustments to observed and anticipated impacts of climate change. So for the sake of the conversation tonight, we're really focused on sea level rise. So we're looking at sea level rise adaptation. So what are communities who are enrolled in the partnership doing to adapt to sea level rise? So without further ado, I'm going to go off my screen share. And I'm going to turn it over to Hannah to kick things off. Thank you, Hannah.
All right, thanks so much, Gail, and hello, everybody. Can I get a thumbs up from someone if you're hearing me okay? Great. All right, I'm going to share my screen. Let's see. Cool. Thanks, Gabe, for the second thumbs up. It's the scariest part always is making sure that screen share and stuff work. So it's so great to be here with all of you tonight. Thanks for taking time out of your evenings to learn about something that those of us presenting spend a lot of time thinking about. We're really looking forward to sharing with you. So I'm more just on the providing information side and really looking forward to hearing from Gail, Tanya, and Gabe later about actual sort of action steps communities can take. So we'll talk about why sea level rise is occurring, what we think is going to happen in the future in terms of sea level rise, what the impacts of sea level rise in Maine are, and then some resources that are out there for assessing sea level rise and coastal flooding hazards. So this is a graph just showing inches of sea level above relative to 2000 sea level over time. So we've experienced about 7 inches of sea level rise in the last 100 years, but about 5 of those inches have occurred since 1970. So not only is sea level rising, it's rising faster and faster. So up until now, most sea level rise has come from mountain glaciers melting and warmer ocean water getting warmer and just taking up more space, because when water is warmer, the molecules vibrate faster and the ocean gets bigger. The thing to point out here is that relatively little sea level rise has come from Greenland and Antarctica so far. And we'll talk more about this in a bit, but these are the massive ice sheets that are sitting on top of the North Pole, that's Greenland, and then in the South Pole, that's East and West Antarctica. And one thing that's sort of curious, so this gray line is the global average sea level rise. But when you look at sea level rise in the northeastern United States, it's been quite a bit faster than the global average. And it turns out when you look at sea level rise throughout the country, throughout the world, the rate of sea level rise varies quite a lot. So all of these circles are places where we've had a tide gauge sitting in the water for long enough to assess long-term rates of sea level rise. And where you see reds, we're experiencing faster rates, like faster than the global average. And then where you see blues, we're actually seeing sea level falling. And so there are all kinds of local processes, in addition to sort of those large scale ice melting type processes that I showed on the first slide that contribute to sea level rise. So you experience sea level rise if the ocean goes up, but also if where you're standing on land is going down, you will experience sea level rise relative to where you're standing. So for example, that's what's going on up here where sea level is falling. The earth has a crust that moves, and those forces cause earthquakes. They also cause Earth's crust to kind of buckle in places, and you have land uplifting along the Alaska coast. So that's why it looks like sea level is falling. On the other hand, the fastest rates of sea level rise in the country are along the Gulf of Mexico coast, where we've been extracting oil and water from soft sediment, and that loss in pore water pressure causes the ground to settle. So where we are in the Northeast and the Gulf of Maine, we have sea level rising faster than the global average for 2 reasons. First, the Gulf Stream, which is the big current that moves warm water from the tropics up towards Europe, is slowing down. And normally it sort of pulls water away from the Gulf of Maine coast as it turns eastward. And as it slows down, you can kind of think of the ocean water as sloshing back up against the coast. And then second, a lot of North America was squished by ice sheets about 20,000 years ago. And that actually sort of caused the Earth's crust to depress in some places and uplift in others. And as we adjust from removing that load from the crust, we're experiencing, land is uplifting kind of up around Hudson Bay where the thickest part of the ice sheet was, and we're sinking a little bit in the Gulf of Maine where the crust used to be bowed upwards. All right, so that's kind of the story about what's been going on to date. But if we look out into the future and think about how much sea level will rise, we often see pictures that look like this. The axes are not important. This is just sort of a general point. So this is showing sea level change from the year 2020 all the way on the left. I know the numbers are tiny, out to 2150 all the way on the right. Through about the middle of this century, we have a pretty good idea of what's going to happen. Like the spread in possibilities is not too big. But by the time you get out to like the 2100, then 2150, it's literally saying there's a 10-foot range and like what could happen. And so if you're someone who's tasked with trying to plan into the future for sea level rise, what are you supposed to do with this kind of information? So I think I'll explain a little bit about what's the deal with all this uncertainty? Where does it come from? When are we going to have less of it? And how has Maine been handling this uncertainty in its planning? So, like I mentioned, so far, relatively little sea level rise has come from Greenland and Antarctica, about 2 inches, 1.8 inches in total. If you were to melt the entire ice sheets, you would raise sea level over 200 feet. And I'm not saying that's what's going to happen. It's just that there is a lot of ice locked up in those things. And so far, they've been relatively stable. What we now know to be true is that as we heat up the planet, there are these sort of physical thresholds we can cross with the ice sheets. You can think of there being like this gate almost that's holding, that's keeping the ice sheets melting slowly. And at some point you warm enough that you lift the gate and suddenly you get much more rapid melt of ice sheets than we've seen so far. That's not reversible, kind of on the timescales that humans think about. That being said, there's still a lot of uncertainty in when we reach those sorts of tipping points. And then once we reach them, how fast these processes kick in. So that's why we have a pretty good deal about what's going to happen until sort of midway through the century. And then after that, it's all about like, what are humans going to do? Are we going to continue warming things enough that we might cross these thresholds? And then when exactly do we reach them? The good news there is as time goes on, we'll have a lot more certainty in like what humans are doing. So how much things are going to warm. And there's been a massive push to put a lot more instruments out in Greenland and Antarctica to try to actually measure the response of these ice sheets and what they're doing. So the picture will become clearer. All right, and Maine has done something really, really great. They've said, okay, I know there's a lot of uncertainty. There are a lot of scenarios out there, but let's get on the same page and agree as a state what we are going to commit to managing statewide. So a panel of experts came together and wrote this fabulous report, The Scientific Assessment of Climate Change and Its Effects in Maine. And they looked at all the scenarios out there and said, okay, what we think is most likely going to happen. We are going to commit to managing 1.5 feet of sea level rise in 2050 relative to the year 2000 and 4 feet of sea level rise in 2100. And this 4-foot number, to reach that value, we would need to have pretty significant contributions from these ice sheets. So it's somewhat of a conservative estimate for sea level rise, but it's very kind of reasonable and a good planning target. And even as new reports have come out and these numbers have changed a little bit, these values have continued to be very good planning targets. So one thing I often think about is like, okay, what's the big deal about 1.5 feet of sea level rise, especially given that where we live in Maine, we have these huge tide ranges relative to 1.5 feet. And I think perhaps the easiest way to think about it is in terms of the frequency of coastal flooding. So I took where I live in Portland, Maine as an example. And in 2000, we were experiencing flooding on high tide. So sunny days, no storm, just a regular old high tide, or, a higher than average high tide, about 3 days per year. If you raise sea level 1.5 feet, suddenly you start getting high tide flooding over 100 days a year. You raise sea level 4 feet, you're flooding nearly every day. And that might seem like kind of bonkers that, this much sea level rise could literally change the way we have to interact with the built environment that we live in. But if you think about it, the built environment was built to sort of just like withstand a certain sea level that we expected to maintain, to stay constant. So an analogy I like to think of is, we built door frames for people that are the size that, we think most people are. So maybe the very tallest people right now will bonk their heads on door frames when they walk through doors. But suddenly, if you put everybody on 6-inch stilts, you'd have people who are like not crazy tall, but pretty tall bonking their heads. And that represents a lot more people. You put everyone on 1-foot stilts, and then, a ton of nearly everybody who's an adult is hitting their head on a door. Same deal with sea level rise. And then a few additional impacts to think about beyond coastal flooding. As the level of the ocean rises, you just have more water pushing up against the freshwater saltwater boundary for aquifers that reach the coastline. So you can end up having saltwater contamination of coastal ponds and groundwater aquifers. Like our built environment, natural environments or natural ecosystems such as beaches, dunes, bluffs, salt marshes, those are also environments that are really like meant to be at a specific elevation relative to sea level. So for example, that Maine scientific and technical report I mentioned before reported that if you raise sea level 1.6 feet, you lose the majority of your dry beach area. And then same deal, salt marshes are designed to be at a very specific elevation within the tidal frame. So thinking about salt marsh vulnerability to sea level rise is something a lot of folks in the state are doing good work on right now. All right, last little bit from me is talking about some resources that are out there. How am I doing on time, Gabe? Because I could skip this. I don't have a clock with me.
You're doing great. You got about 3 more minutes.
Perfect. Okay, chime in if I go over, but I think I can wrap it up by then. So you all are likely familiar with FEMA's National Flood Insurance Program publishing these flood insurance rate maps. So they are mapping the floodplain of the present day 1% annual chance flood event, also colloquially sometimes called the 100-year flood event. So in any given year, it has a 1% chance of happening. On average, it'll happen once every 100 years. The tricky thing with these is these are for quote current conditions, but often really they're like historical conditions when sea level was lower. They're also sort of county by county. They're created with different methodologies. Some are sound, some are not. Pete Slavinsky at the Maine Geological Survey also put together this really fabulous mapping tool that maps water levels on top of land elevations. So it takes highest astronomical tide. So that's like just the highest tide you would expect to see within a 20-year period. And then says, okay, if you were to raise water level 1.2 feet above that, then we're 1.6 feet above that, what areas would be underwater? This is often called a bathtub approach to mapping flooding because it's assuming that if that water level raises by the same amount everywhere and that everything below that elevation will be underwater. The tricky thing with that is if you think about a storm, imagine like blowing a giant powerful fan over a bathtub, your water surface elevation is going to have a slope. And that's exactly what happens during storms. So here's an example from Boston where if you just you take a water level and you map it onto topography, you get the same flood extent everywhere. But then if you actually we call it dynamically simulate what the effect of wind during a storm does to water, you get this sort of sloping water surface and it's higher where the reds are. So this is probably a nor'easter hitting the Boston coast. And then you can even do things like put dams in your model. So you can see that water can't overtop dams. So one thing that's very exciting, this approach is coming to Maine. Their Maine DOT is funding the development of a statewide flood model that will simulate the combined effects of sea level rise, tides, storm surge, waves, and even river flooding. And we expect it to be done late 2025. There are some other existing models in pockets of Maine, but I think I'm out of time, so I'm gonna stop talking, and my email address is up here. So if you want to learn more about that coming Maine DOT model or any other existing models in the state, please reach out to me. And again, thanks so much for your time.
Thanks, Hannah. Thanks so much. And I just want to acknowledge that Hannah is joining us from Germany tonight. So she's going to hop off early, but we are collecting questions, and we'll direct those to Gail if Hannah is not on the call anymore. Thanks so much for being here tonight, Hannah. We appreciate it. And now I'll turn things over to Gail.
Thanks so much, Gabe, and thank you, Hannah. So my job is to kind of take all that data that Hannah presented, and then how do we add in the human element to how we make decisions and how communities start to grapple with climate planning, and how do we plan for a changing coastline that we're bound to experience in the next few decades and definitely far into the future. So I always start my talks with sharing this photo of my kids at the beach. This is Crescent Beach down in Cape Elizabeth. And I invite you to kind of bring into mind a photo or a place that means something to you along the coastline too. And I'm sure in Maine that we all have that kind of special location for us, and to think about how you've observed change over time in this location, and also like what that means to you. Because as we look along the coastline, we can definitely see evidence of climate impacts over time. Looking at this photo, you can see that the seaweed is being pushed all the way up into the dune grass. And with a statistic Hannah shared earlier, with 1.6 feet of sea level rise, the amount of dry beach here on Crescent will be pretty much zero underneath or with that sea level rise scenario. So also with this too, I really invite you to not just bring in your observations, but to bring in kind of your emotions to it. I want you to invite you to bring those into the conversations around sea level rise and climate impacts more generally in our communities. We're all going to be impacted by climate in different ways, and understanding those different ways is really important to guide community conversations. So that way we're honoring everybody's perspective within communities. So just inviting that to the table as well. And that's a lot of the work that we do at GMRI is facilitating conversations with communities that really brings values to the forefront of those conversations before we dig into the conversation about, well, what do we then do about climate change? So I'm going to kind of start to visualize some of the data that Hannah shared. We'll look at different community impacts and looking at the different types of communities that we have throughout the state and the different challenges that they're going to be facing under different scenarios. And while we're doing that, just think about the types of questions that these communities are going to need to grapple with. It's no straightforward answer as to, well, it's going to flood here, so build X, Y, Z, and that will keep the water out or elevate. We have lots of options, but the answers aren't always clear. So we're going to start down in Wells, which is a beach community. You can see there's a lot of homes, often second homes that are right along the beach. This is just, we'll start with like the normal high tide or mid tide, I guess. I'm not sure what time this photo was taken from satellites, but this is what it would look like with 1.5 feet of sea level rise. So that scenario that we've committed to planning for by the year 2050 as a state. So you can see some really severe impacts to that coastal community, as well as cutting off access to the beach community. And with 4 feet of sea level rise, it looks like this. So for our low-lying beach areas, we're going to see really severe impacts to those residential communities that are right on the coast. In Portland, we have more of an urban waterfront With 1.5 feet of sea level rise, we start to see areas that used to be marsh or wetlands start to become wet again. A lot of coastal cities have areas that are fill, where we've expanded our land and taken over wetland to grow urban cities. So think about this, if this is happening in an area where you live, and those would be areas that would be vulnerable first. And you can really see that start to take shape with 4 feet of sea level rise here in Portland. It's starting to look more like the shape that it did in the 1700s. I've also heard a term too, and thinking about this as well, when we're having the water come all the way up into an urban area. This is like an urban intertidal zone. So thinking about how do we adapt to that. Up to Woolwich. So this is Route 1, Taste of Maine restaurant there, in case you're familiar with that area. This aerial photo really demonstrates salt marshes and how they can change really drastically when we put these tidal crossings, such as roads over top. You can see the salt marsh change really quickly here. An interesting project happening in Woolwich now. I'm not sure if Gabe or Tanya are planning on highlighting that one, but they're currently elevating this roadway. So I'm very curious to see how that work impacts the marsh health in that space. Some reasons for doing that, with 1.5 feet of sea level rise, Route 1, which is a major corridor for here, will be cut off. With 4 feet, it will be flooding really frequently. So that's a high priority area for investing action now. As is Damascotta, again, there's a project that is planned here. Their Maine downtown is right in this view. With 1.5 feet of sea level rise, you can see a lot of water coming into a parking area, and a lot of where their kind of economic engine is for the community, flooding a lot of basements for those buildings. 4 feet of sea level rise, it's pretty much half of their downtown will be underwater. So they're currently working on, back up a second, a seawall to block off water from coming into the parking lot area, as well as raising that parking lot area. So adapting to keep the water out. All right, and not to forget our tidal rivers in Maine. So popping up river to Bangor. For any of our rivers before a dam comes into play are also experiencing tides. So Bangor is also will be impacted by sea level rise. Again, these are kind of not as accurate as looking at this model. As Hannah mentioned, this is a bathtub model, and there's a lot of factors at play. Rivers are also experiencing water coming down through the watershed, fresh water from ice melt and precipitation. So a lot of factors at play with flooding, but sea level is definitely one of them too. And this is an area where we do need to do more research to understand how the salt water and the fresh water influences will impact flooding in our tidal rivers. But for just sea level rise, this would be 1.5 feet and 3 feet along their downtown area. And then in Maine, we have a lot of peninsulas that are connected by causeways, and often those are rather low-lying. So this is the causeway out to Deer Isle and Stonington, which is experiencing flooding during high tide events now, completely underwater with 1.5 feet of sea level rise and with 4 feet of sea level rise. So understanding these pinch points in communities is really important, especially as we're thinking about emergency services and how people can still access those when there may be an emergency, and maintaining that access should be a really high priority for making decisions. And then out to Vinyl Haven, strong working waterfront culture here in Maine, huge economy. So really important to think about how we think about these infrastructures and continue to kind of build resilience forward to maintain that economy into the future and the infrastructure that they need. So with 1.5 feet of sea level rise, you can see a lot of the working waterfront infrastructure is flooded, as well as their downtown, and 4 feet of sea level rise. So I will share the link to that map. That was the Maine Geological Survey map that Hannah referenced. I'll post that in the chat when I'm done, unless anybody else beats me to it in the meantime. But yeah, I just wanted to share those different examples. We've got 140 coastal communities in Maine, and they're all grappling with really different problems. But there are some where different communities may have things in common. So finding those commonalities where we can learn together as a region and think about how can we plan forward together to think about different adaptation strategies and learn from each other. And as we're thinking about adaptation strategies too, it's not one size fits all solution for sure. And a lot of it has to do with how a community values those different assets that they have that are at risk and how they want to prioritize them moving forward. So here's a few examples. Seawalls or things of this matter are intended to keep the water out. Eventually they will fail. The water will continue to get higher, but it can buy a lot of time for communities to come up with what their strategy is then next. We could decide to live with water. So elevating structures is also an option, and that's starting to happen in some locations, particularly in southern Maine and our southern states. And nature-based solutions is also a really like a solution that's promoted quite a bit right now, particularly for different funding structures. As I pointed out some different marshes along the way while we looked at some different communities, they were our front lines to the coastline and absorbed a lot of the energy from waves, absorbed water, made the storms less impactful to communities. So how can we bring back that natural barrier that played a really important role along our coastlines? So some thoughts around that are some dune restoration along our beaches to get roots into the sand and to keep the sand in place. And then also along our marshes and seagrass beds as well. How can we bring in more sediment to promote them in growing back after erosion events? And we're also going to have to be really open-minded too, to at some point, none of these solutions are going to make sense for a community, and managed retreat may be the best option. And it's not necessarily a community as a whole, but it might be neighborhoods within a community where we're just going to need to decide that it's no longer financially feasible, safe to continue to invest in a space. So how do we begin those conversations around managed retreat? So as you can imagine, with all these conversations, there's a lot of emotion around them because we are humans living in these communities. And it's really important to find ways to engage in those conversations because we're thinking about our future, our kids and our grandkids' future. So planning for future generations within the communities that we care about. So I encourage you just to take a minute and drop in the chat. What are some of the things that you value about your community? Whether that's having access to natural spaces or being on the coastline, having kind of friendly neighbors. You guys can drop some of those things in the chat. Great. Again, this is a really great place to start the conversation around sea level rise, because we can look to those community values as things that we have in common. And when we're considering climate impacts, we can look to those values as to which ones of these will be most vulnerable when we're looking at climate impacts, but also some of them may be assets that we can deploy to adapt or build resilience strategies moving forward. Again, I encourage you to find ways to engage within your own community, whether that's through supporting the collection of data, through observations, through community or citizen science, or finding opportunities to join small working groups or meetings. I know a lot of communities have climate commissions or climate adaptation work groups or climate crises committees. They go by lots of names. So I encourage you to reach out to find if there is one in your community and how you may participate in that. All right, well, that is it for me. So I'm going to pass things over to Gabe and Tanya.
Thanks so much, Gail. Great to have both you and Hannah, and just thinking so much too about there's so many nuggets that we can take from what you've shared. But I really love the concept similar to bouncing forward versus bouncing back, but the idea of communities planning forward, and not just planning forward on their own, but planning forward together. And hopefully some of the information that Tanya and I will share will highlight how communities are planning forward. And through opportunities with the Community Resilience Partnership, and one of the roles of the regional coordinators, Tanya and myself and our colleagues, is really to help connect communities that might be able to share resources, even projects at times. I'm going to share my screen again, and just again sort of get us into a context, and then move forward with sharing some examples of adaptation strategies from communities. So can everyone see my screen? All right, great. Thank you so much. Just a reminder to please keep putting your questions in the chat, and we will be sure to continue collecting those. And many thanks to Dave Reed Miller at GMRI and to Hannah at GMRI for answering questions that have been put in the chat already. Thanks so much. So building climate resilience. So one thing I think when we talk about this, especially as communities are starting, is the feeling of like overwhelm, because like, where do you start? And the idea is like, really, there's so many avenues to building stronger communities. And chances are, your coastal community is probably doing something already, and it might not appear immediately as what you think of as a climate adaptation. But this is a great community resilience building cycle that was generated by Parker and Nathan with the Maine Climate Change Adaptation Providers Network. And so it just gives you a sense of a community could be anywhere sort of on this circle, and it's really a continuum. So it's an iterative process, it's ongoing. We're always kind of going back and reevaluating when we have more information, when things in communities change, when the science changes. So you'll notice in the examples that Tanya and I share with you tonight that a community might be doing work where they're assessing their risk to climate vulnerabilities, climate impacts. They might be at a place where they've done a project and they're sort of evaluating where they are and figuring out, okay, now that we've done this, what's our next step? What's our next plan of action? And then there are also going to be examples of implementation. So adaptations that are being moved forward to some smaller projects, some larger projects. They all involve planning somewhere along the way. Make a plan is definitely something you'll see a lot tonight when we share these examples. So just wanted to also frame the Community Resilience Partnership in terms of the Maine Won't Wait Climate Action Plan. So as part of communities enrolling in the partnership, I mentioned they need to do a couple of evaluations. And one of the things they do along with a community workshop is they identify what their community priorities are. And as Gail mentioned, really it depends, like what is the community's values? What do we value for our own assets? And how do we want to plan forward as a community? So the partnership has put together this list of 72 priority climate actions. Some of them are focused on adaptation, and you'll see some of those highlighted tonight. And some of them are focused on mitigation. So reducing greenhouse gas emissions are focused in areas of like understanding what a community needs to do to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, or doing a greenhouse gas inventory. So all of those things are part of this 72 priorities checklist as well. So list of actions are divided into strategy areas, and these strategy areas are what directly relates to the Maine Won't Wait Climate Action Plan. And so the sea level rise projects usually fall under strategies E through H, and these can involve anything from protecting the environment and promoting natural climate solutions. Gail mentioned that around all of the different landscape and green type infrastructure opportunities that are available, building healthy and resilient communities, investing in climate ready infrastructure, and also engaging Maine people. So thinking about all of the different ways that communities are engaging with each other and different committees, as Gail mentioned, citizen science projects. So all of those different things fall under these opportunities that are available for funding through the Community Resilience Partnership. And I'll be sure to put a link to the partnership website where you can find this list. You can download, it's an Excel file, and you can download it from the website. Okay, so without further ado, with that little bit of context, I'm going to go ahead and turn things over to Tanya, and we will learn a little bit more about some communities in Region 2. Slight technical difficulties.
You appear to be muted, Tanya.
Okay.
Do you want me to present, Tanya, and then you can?
I think I can get it here. I'm just working on one screen.
Sure. I think we're all
There we go.
used to, and there has to be at least something that happens for technical challenges during these presentations.
Okay, and then phone card slide. There we go. Okay.
Perfect.
Okay.
Yep.
So hi, I'm Tanya. I am from the Region 1 area, so that's Hancock, Waldo, and Washington County. I'm also a little bit of a science fiction fan, so I'm going to make stupid references because that's just how I am. This is the town of Machias that we're looking at right now. This is a view from the dike. The dike was built in the 1850s on dirt and logs. And then we built Route 1 on top of it. So it's our major north-south corridor. The main part of town is back here in the downtown area. In the foreground is some commerce that's built out into that area. It used to be a wetland. Now it's where the Dunkin' Donuts is. So it's incredibly important that we remain connected the whole way through town. So this dike is right in the middle of town. On the right is the Middle River, and on the left is the Machias estuary. So as you see, downtown Machias is at its best about 9 feet above sea level. We have quite a lot of commercial activity going on the dike. All these cars parked here is an informal flea market. And we also have a major ATV trail. That's the Sunrise Trail, and a walking trail running through town. So this is an incredibly important part of infrastructure, and it's right downtown. So it's been a challenge for us to think about how we're going to plan for resilience when we have this kind of thing happening in the center of our town. So this is what I'm gonna have to just move that. this is what it looks like when we have a 3-foot high tide event. So this is not much, and Gail was certainly showing a lot of other pictures. This is the dike right here running across, so that's inundated. Diner number 1, diner number 2, hardware store and lumber yard, gas station, bank. It's pretty much all of the main commerce that happens in our town is underwater with a pretty moderate event. Deeply concerning right here. Can you see my cursor moving? Thumbs up? Yeah, okay. Right here, disturbingly, is our wastewater treatment facility. So that's also underwater. So it has some major public health impacts as well as being drowning all our commercial district as well. So when we have a night when, you know, the winds are blowing and the king tide comes, we do not get Aquaman in our town. What we get is this. This is flooding right downtown. Right there's the diner, gas station, just a little bit above water in this photograph. So this is a king tide. You'll notice we don't have any kind of event happening. It's just a normal cloudy day in Matthias. These blue sky events are happening more and more for us. I've appreciated you guys talking a little bit about them already. So this is our pier. And it's the end of the pier is here. And this is, again, another king tide where we have water all the way up to the parking area. And the dike is over in this area here. This is a photograph from the dike after we've had a big event. This is all seaweed. So this has come across the dike and just sat there. So we have events where we have water this high going on. And again, this is not a storm. This is behind the hardware store right in downtown. The second gas station in town is right there. And this would be the area where we want to do some protection work. I'll talk about that in a minute. So what's Matthias doing? Matthias is doing a lot of things, and I was pleased to see you all talking about a fair number of them. We're looking at marsh restoration. Right along here, you see a train track running. That's now Rails to Trail, Sunrise Trail. It's cut off this piece of saltwater marsh from the main part of the estuary. Because of that, the saltwater marsh has subsided. It's been ditched and diked as well. Since all that organic matter is sitting there, if it doesn't get more contributions from the estuary, it starts to rot out and sag and sink. We need this marsh to be functioning properly so that sometimes when we have high water events, this area can again function as a buffer and a protection for the town. Right here is the dike. This dike is going to become a bridge. That's going to be happening through work with DOT, so the town is not having to deal with the funding of such a big project. It's going to be incredibly painful, though. As you see, all of this is going to potentially be inundated. It's marsh now, and it's going to get wetter there. There's a lot of pain there in our community because people are going to lose land. And, you know, it's been framed a little bit as, you know, we're going to lose land because the dike is going, but the truth is the dike is already being overtopped and it is going. So what is happening before is we have some clappers here that keep the tide from coming in. But when the tide's going right over the top of it, those clappers aren't helping protect this land back here anyway. This is going to eventually be, it looks like from all the planning, a bridge, which will have some pluses and some minuses. Like I said, there's no solution that's happening in these towns that doesn't have a lot of pain attached to it. We are going to build a seawall right along here where the orange is, and that will protect the downtown area from those high tide events, at least for a certain amount of time. And we're also upgrading our wastewater treatment facility. So we're doing all of these different projects. It was kind of interesting. You were saying some of these towns are doing some things and some towns are doing other things. Because Machias is so low and their commercial area is being inundated already, they're really trying to do all the things they can with an understanding that this is a temporary solution. Eventually, we're going to lose the downtown probably, or portions of it, and have to do something else. Hopefully, we can hold it off to a place where we can make that retreat thoughtful and well planned to minimize the inevitable pain that's going to come from that situation. This is what the dike's going to look like when it's been completed with a bridge element to it, still nice and wide, so we can have the Sunrise Trail, and definitely some conversation about including some sort of open air market area option for us. The wastewater treatment facility, right now, we have part of a community up here on the hill on the other side of the Matthias River, and that's gravity fed coming down under the river and going over the treatment facility. What we're having now during high water events is that's being inundated, so we have seawater coming in there, which means the wastewater treatment facility is overflowing. We're having, unfortunately, releases of sewage out here, which has a big impact, not just for public health, but also the clamming community is trying to make their living down here and further out. And so we're having clam flat closures. So this is being upgraded so that the station can pump even when we're having a high water event, so we don't have overflows, or we will probably still have occasional overflows, but limited. Let's see. This is the Sunrise Trail running down along and over the dike into the downtown. And back here is Shopping Marsh, which you can see is a big mud flat. It's not really functioning as it should be for a tidewater marsh. See how much lower it is than sea level right here. So we have a major project going on to improve the water flow in and out of here to make it more natural, and possibly also build this back up, which is going to be quite a challenging project, so that this functions better, and so that when we have big water events, at least some of that water can go into this the way it's supposed to. Lastly, we're going to do a seawall. So this will be along the Matthias River. This is behind one of our busiest hotels. The thinking is this walkway along here, a river walk, is going to be stackable, so we can build this up and have a couple iterations of relief, and giving us a little more time to do what we need to do and deal with things. So 4 different projects going on, a town that's not too big. We have just over 2,000 people. This is a lot happening. And so one of the things the the Community Resilience Partnership wanted to do with the town here was the town suggested they needed someone to help us. They needed the one ring because we have all these different partners working. And the idea is we want to make that efficient and thoughtful and have as much cross-project communication and community collaboration between all these partners, so that we got a good product for what we're doing, and so that there's some sense and some reason and some order to these projects. So the one ring for them was a $45,000 grant from the Community Action Grant pot to have a person come on and provide project management for all 4 of those projects, so that they're working in coordination with each other, and we can have a big picture approach to it. Of course, there's going to have to be a pipe running through the seawall area to bring that sewage across the river. We're going to need the dike and the seawall to link up. We're going to need all these things to be working together. So the one ring is the Matthias Bay Master Plan that's going to come out of this. We're really hoping that we're learning as we're doing these things. Matthias has been very proactive because it's pretty low-lying, but there are a lot of other low-lying places like Deer Isle. I think Jim Fisher's on the line, who could talk more about that too. What we're learning in Deer Isle and Matthias and the towns that are being as proactive as they can be, hopefully will help other towns plan. So Deer Isle has also gotten a community action grant to do comprehensive planning that really incorporates all these climate resilience thoughts and approaches, where they're concerned with their causeway, because this is what their causeway looks like on a bad day too. So we're hoping we can learn and share from each other as we do this planning and thinking. I think this is Deer Isle, water coming in on, again, another day with a lot of wind. It's a big job. And that's the thing. These are huge problems being directed at very tiny towns, and the capacity there is not great. The will and the community resolve is fantastic. They want to keep these communities, and we should be able to find a way. Ideally, the Community Resilience Partnership can help them get the technical support they need, the grant writing, so that we can find the money, get the grants, get the assistance to make sure these communities really remain really vibrant and livable and the beautiful places we enjoy. So thank you, and this is where sea level rise. This is an exciting moment down on Scudic Point. So thank you guys for listening, and yeah, shoot us questions.
Great. Thanks so much, Tanya. And for folks that do have to jump off, this recording will be available, and we're close to wrapping up, and then we'll move to questions, but just wanted to give folks an opportunity to make sure you put your questions in the chat, so we can get them answered. And anyone who's registered for this talk will get an email regarding follow-up with questions and the recording for the presentation. So I'm gonna just share really briefly, just do some sort of quick flashes of a couple of communities in Region 1 and their how they've used their community action grants to address climate adaptation. So I'll share my screen, and we can just look at those two communities real quick. So the first one, which is kind of an interesting approach. And so as I mentioned, I work with several other colleagues as a regional. We are together regional coordinators as a collaborative for Region 1. So Southern Maine Planning and Development Commission is one of those collaborators in our region, Region 1 coordinator collaborative. And so Southern Maine Planning and Development Commission applied to the Community Resilience Partnership for a service provider grant to work with several communities in Southern Maine. They also, on behalf of Biddeford, Kennebunkport, and Kittery, applied for a multi-municipal community action grant. And so if towns see regional opportunities, and here's one, they're doing a cohort approach to climate adaptation planning. And so for folks who are unfamiliar with a climate adaptation plan, it's essentially a strategic plan that lays out policies and programs for reducing communities' greenhouse gas emissions and adapting to the impacts of climate change. So this has to do with both adaptation and mitigation. So plans for these coastal communities will really establish actions for adapting to climate change-induced impacts and hazards, including sea level rise. So they kind of have the broad scope of both mitigation and adaptation priorities that are going to be identified and addressed in these climate action plans. But the opportunity for funding through the Community Resilience Partnership for multi-municipal projects, and that can be up to 5 communities getting together to apply, is $125,000 as of the last grant round. So it's $50,000 for individual communities. So even if you have 2 communities coming together, there's a benefit to applying for a joint project. So here's an example, a cohort approach to climate action planning. They will end up with individual climate action plans, but they're doing it as a cohort. And we talked a lot about communities learning from each other, sharing resources, and this is a great example of that. I'm also just going to share really quickly about Rockland. So Rockland is developing, or they've really started. They are doing a climate ready engineering design, and they're doing a lot. This is around site improvements for Rockland's municipally owned downtown waterfront. So it's really what they need sort of as a preliminary engineering to begin to get funding that they need for implementation. So they have a bunch of ideas that they're going to integrate, and here you'll see a preliminary engineering concept drawing. So it's not just about, we need to raise things for sea level rise, but it's really about thinking about how the community is using this downtown waterfront. What sort of enhancements can we do as we are adapting to sea level rise to build a stronger community overall? And so they're thinking a lot here about not just climate resilience, but like the social resilience and enhancements of the community as well. So this was a $50,000 community action grant that is covering the cost of the preliminary engineering and these concept designs that they need to move this project forward. So I will stop there with the examples. I want to say there's many other examples. I'm going to put some information in the chat regarding how you can access a list of all the different community action grants that were awarded in the spring of this year and what types of projects communities are doing. There is another round of community action grants being awarded very soon, likely the very beginning of December. Communities who applied in September will hear if they received an award, or excuse me, I think they applied in October, and see if they received their awards for the projects that they want to implement. And the next round for communities who are enrolled in the partnership will be March of 2023. So here's all of our contact information. Please do reach out with questions. If you are an enrolled community, you hear from me, and you will be hearing from me more often if you're in Region 1, and likely you've already heard from me somewhat, or from colleagues in our cohort. Again, that is Southern Maine Planning and Development Commission, Abby and Karina, you probably know, GPCOG, Greater Portland Council of Governments, that's Sarah Mills-Knapp. And then my colleagues, Emily Robbie and Laura Graziano at Lincoln County Regional Planning Commission. And so any one of us we are the Region 1 coordinator collaborative, so do reach out to us. And if you're in Region 2 community interested in the partnership or an enrolled community, Tanya is your contact person. So again, if folks need to jump off, please do. This recording will be made available to you via an email sent to everyone who's registered. I'm going to stop my screen share and see if there's any questions, and we can open it up to those questions. So I think we have a great question here. And first off, I just want to acknowledge some of the questions that are in the chat have been answered. When Hannah was on, she was able to answer a question. Dave Reed Miller from GMRI has also been answering some questions. Thanks, Dave. And also Gail, thank you for answering some questions as well. And I will just say to Tracy, I will do my best to answer your question as well for the island communities that are part of the city of Portland. From Pauline, your question, Kennebunk and Kittery are not contiguous communities. How do they work together? So I think this is great. I'm going to put in the chat just a link to the climate cohort that makes up the Biddeford, Kennebunk, Kennebunkport, and Kittery climate action planning cohort. And I just encourage you to go to that website to learn more. But really what they're doing is just taking a cohort approach. They're each producing individual climate action plans, but they're leveraging resources among themselves. So they have one engagement person or firm that's been hired to work with all of the communities. There's Southern Maine Planning and Development Commission is doing one sort of like workshopping process where they do have things with individual communities, but they also bring everyone together. So it's just a lot of sharing resources, looking for those areas where they could collaborate. Maybe there's problems that need to be solved jointly. So it's not all about like what's an infrastructure project we could do together. It's sort of looking at regional opportunities and what those might be. So it might just be around technical assistance as opposed to implementation projects for large infrastructure endeavors. So it really just depends on the community. And I think just to know, it just takes a commitment on behalf of those communities to be willing to enter into a process that is multi-municipal. And of course, it really helps to have the leadership and the support of a service provider. And in this case, Southern Maine Planning and Development Commission, who are organizing and facilitating that process for the municipalities and their very active and engaged committees and volunteers. So check out the website. That's really helpful, and it gives you a sense of how everyone's working together and the ways that information is being shared and resources are being shared. I think I want to just quickly address, and this is specific to, so it may not be relevant to some folks, but it's interesting to me nonetheless. So when the Community Resilience Partnership first started, it was essentially funding for municipalities and tribal governments. And there are a lot of unorganized territories out there. This last funding round, the state opened it up to unorganized territories as well, who are often pulling together and applying through their county commissioners, through the counties themselves. So the other question related to that Tracy has asked, so it's just about the Portland Islands that are part of the city of Portland. So because they're very independent, but they're still part of the city of Portland. The city of Portland is enrolled in the Community Resilience Partnership. So it's really this question of how do those islands access funding through the partnership, or how do they get access to the technical assistance that's available through the partnership? And I think I just want to thank Gail because she was able to really highlight some of those resources that are available to communities, regardless of if they're enrolled in the partnership or not. Some of those include the New England Environmental Finance Center. And Gail also mentioned that the organization she works for, GMRI, is going to be hiring a climate finance program manager. So and the other important thing that Gail highlighted was for those islands that are part of other municipalities, or in this case, the city of Portland, to work with the sustainability coordinator in the Portland office and really share information about what those islands' goals are in relation to the climate action plan for Portland. How are you part of that, and what can you take advantage of in terms of what the city is offering? And certainly, because I'm the one of the regional coordinators, also Sarah Mills-Knapp from Greater Portland Council of Governments. She's your contact for Region 1 in terms of the Community Resilience Partnership. So you can definitely reach out to her. You can reach out to me. We're available to provide information and resources. It sounds like a matter of coordinating and collaborating with the city in terms of accessing funding through a community action grant. But certainly you have our attention in terms of technical assistance and other ways we can assist you. So hopefully that answered your question. So I think if anyone else has a question, I would just ask you to come off of chat to answer that. I see, James, you have a couple of questions. Do you want to ask those off of chat?
Sure, I'm always happy to speak. Part of it, we probably in Deer Isle I made a terrible mistake trying to do too many things with this grant, but we're an island and we need a sort of comprehensive approach. One small piece of that is trying to figure out if there are successful green shoreline stabilization initiatives. I've seen a huge number of requests for riprap, and it's one of the most common building permit requests we get. And I'm skeptical that that's good for the environment, and I don't even think it's sustainable in the long run. But people are trying to harden the shoreline all the way around, and it's creating new dynamics in the transport of silt and sand, and I think causing erosion in other places. So yeah, the idea of attenuating wave activity and currents by greener strategies is very appealing, but I haven't seen a very systematic catalog of the kinds of strategies that are being tested and whether there's somebody trying to track what works and doesn't work over time.
Yeah, thanks. I wanted to just point out Parker's response in the chat with some examples and some direction to go in, and also Gail offering a resource on living shorelines from the state's perspective. Does anyone who is on the call that has that expertise want to provide any additional information in terms of adding to what Gail and Parker have offered in the chat?
And understand, I mean, these are nice examples, but I'm looking for the state to do, or maybe it's a federal activity, to really make this a systematic database with timelines, cost of implementation, materials used, and evaluations, 1, 5, and 10 years later.
Yeah, and I think anything like that, certainly it's like, I'm sure like conversations, like conversation with Tanya bringing that to the folks that we're meeting with regularly. And Parker, you gave a thumbs up. Did you want to weigh in on that as well?
I just think it's such a perfect request, Jim. I think you're spot on in terms of those, compiling some of these best practices into a resource that assists communities and assists contractors who are working on shoreline erosion. I think you've really hit the nail on the head in terms of a resource that's needed. And there's a lot of folks who have a lot of expertise in this arena. And I think they're kind of working in that direction, but it's great to hear there's such a specific need from Deer Isle and others.
Yeah, I'll just pop in there too, like for your example, James, and the one that Tracy shared too, are your questions. Like hearing these questions about what needs communities have, what barriers they're coming up against, what policies aren't working for you in order to like progress your climate plans or your resilience actions. That's all really important to voice and for us to hear, and particularly Gabe and Tanya and the roles that they're in with the GoPIF partnerships program. So that way we can make advancements at that level, that policy level, in order to support these actions and being more efficient. So yeah, thanks for asking these questions, even though we might not have answers yet.
If folks have any other questions you would like to ask before we call it a night.
Gabe, hidden in the chat, there's a great question that Dave asked, and actually it was one I had too for Tanya. Like you shared such an awesome example of the multiple approaches that Machias has in their plan, and the process for getting to that plan must have just been really quite gnarly. I think that's Dave's word. So could you elaborate a bit on that process and who was involved and maybe some lessons learned through that?
Sure, I can tell you a little bit because it was gnarly. I've only been involved in parts of it. So before I came over to working for the Community Resilience Partnership, I was doing running a land trust, and so had a lot of work to do with the Shoppy Marsh project, getting that up off the ground, getting funding for it, working with the landowner to get permission to do the work, being aware there was Army Corps stuff, there was DOT stuff, because an old rail bed running through the property means that it needs to be maintained to carry a train someday, maybe, which means any bridge or change would mean it has to be able to carry a train, not just an ATV and 5 people on a bike. So what we saw happen was there were some projects like that were pretty siloed. The wastewater treatment facility upgrade was pretty siloed. And then there was a Machias Revitalization Committee that was looking at the downtown flooding. There were a number of both conservation organizations, DOT, the town government, a lot of different groups involved in the dike, because the dike had fish passage issues, as well as all kinds of land loss, huge engineering problems. And so what we did see was we were starting to see the same old characters in every one of these different meetings. And I think that's really what provoked the town to say, okay, we need something to kind of bring it together. And that's what got them thinking that this was a priority for them to do for their first community action grant. So they saw that siloed thing starting to go like this and being horrifying. And this was an attempt to try to just bring it together with some kind of sense. I think that's pretty much the way a lot of small communities operate. Different groups become really passionate about different aspects. And after a while, they're like, wait a second, I was talking to you at the Dike meeting, and now we're talking about the seawall. Maybe we should have just like one group. So we're still working in different pockets, but at least now there's much better communication and organization.
Thanks, Tanya. Thanks for the follow-up on that too, Gail. Any other questions before we sign off for the night? All right, you will be receiving a follow-up just with a link to access the recording, and you'll probably see it if you're on the Region 1 or Region 2 email list. You'll probably see it in that as well. I will say I mentioned this before, we don't have a date yet, but we are offering the second presentation in the Building Stronger Communities series in December. That's the plan. We will put out a date via all the channels that you probably access to get information about this one. So that's going to be rather than a sea level rise 101, that will be a climate 101, and we won't be talking about adaptation strategies. We'll be talking about mitigation strategies. So that will just sort of provide an overview, and then in the new year, we're hoping to sort of hone in and do some more detailed information around funding and implementation. I want to thank again both Gail and Hannah joining us from GMRI with your expertise, and Tanya from Region 2 sharing a very dynamic story about Machias and everything that they're doing to address climate impacts in their community. So thanks, everyone. We will hopefully see you at the next conversation. If you celebrate the holiday this week, enjoy, and we will hopefully see you in December. Take care.